I now recognize Ms. Lesko from Arizona for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Swig, you asked a great question. Were our schools an essential service? Yes. My answer is yes. And so it boggles my mind that we had grocery stores open, Walmart open, and all these other businesses deemed essential services that were open, yet we closed schools. Sweden kept daycare and schools open throughout the spring of 2020 for all children ages 1 through 15 without social distancing, masks, or testing. As of June 2020, among the 1.8 million children in this age group, 0 died from COVID-19 and only a few were hospitalized. In May 2020, the Center for Global Development released a report that failed to find any increase in community COVID-19 case rates related to school reopenings internationally. On August 7th, 2020, the CDC itself published an MMWR study based on COVID-net data, which clearly established the low risk to American children. In August of 2020, Australia and South Korea data showed that secondary infection rates were very low in schools. Yet, even with all this data showing that children were at low risk of having serious COVID effects and low transmission risks to adults, the CDC set guidelines in the fall of 2020 that would keep 99% of American schools closed. Evidence, as shown by emails between the teacher union and the CDC, show that the CDC was greatly influenced by the teacher union and, in fact, added language verbatim suggested by the teacher union. Mr. Swig, why do you think the CDC seemed to listen more to input from the teacher unions than from scientific data from other countries and from their own scientific report?
Thank you, Congresswoman. I can't speak to the mindset of the people in charge of the CDC, but the broader context of your question, I think, is highly relevant. And with all due respect to the other Congress member, I think it's entirely appropriate to look at what happened in Europe and elsewhere. Those are human beings, they're children, they're in schools. I've lived in Europe, their schools, they have very crowded cities, they do not have sophisticated HVAC systems in all of their schools. That is real evidence in front of us, and I think we're talking about the difference between looking at models, looking at projections over empirical data, looking at theory over what we actually were observing. And I think that's incredibly important, and it's one of the things that I've been studying and been so fascinated by is this sort of very, very myopic, American-centric idea that nothing else is happening outside of our bubble. We had actual real-world evidence from schools in countries throughout Europe with cities, very similar demographics to our cities. The class sizes were not, 3 kids in a giant room, and that evidence for complex reasons was disregarded.
Thank you. Ms. Gentles, in Arizona and elsewhere, school districts created in-person hubs where low-wage staff monitored in-person students who sat in front of their laptops while the teachers still worked remotely. This happened in Arizona to my grandkids. The governor put out an executive order saying that students needed to have a place to go if their parents had to work and they had no place else to go. So my question is, if it was safe for low-wage workers to be in the presence of children in schools, why was it unsafe for teachers to be in the schools with the children?
Yes, this happened in Virginia, where I live. It happened in California. It happened all around the country. Schools turned into daycares with low-wage workers who were not unionized. And I think that's the essential issue here. The teachers' unions had made a decision that they needed to control the instructional hours that were offered, and whether or not schools were open and teachers were going to teach in the classroom, and they were going to do that. And I'm speaking about the unions, not the individual classroom teachers. The unions were going to do that until the American Rescue Plan came forward with 122 additional billion federal dollars. So there were 3 big bills that offered the ESSER funds that we've been talking about, the supplemental federal emergency funding, March 2020, and then winter, December, January, and then again, March 2021, that final ARP. They were waiting until that final 122 billion ARP funding came through, and then schools could open up and the unionized teachers could return to classrooms fully that fall.
Thank you, and I yield back.